What I wanted to talk about indeed is the research that we're doing at the moment in Munich, also in collaboration with some people at the University of Exeter, where this research actually started, which concerns the conditions under which open science works for science, and situations where this may actually not be quite as obvious, and what we can do about this. And so without further ado, I just want to set the scene, first of all, in terms of where is that we're coming from and why we're worrying about these kind of questions. Why shouldn't it be self-evident that doing open research and open publishing is a good thing for everybody? And this is really started by looking not so much at open science per se, but at science as a whole, and what kind of concerns we have at the moment with respect to science as a whole. So first of all, obviously, you're all very aware, being active and interested in open science and open publishing, that there are serious ongoing problems with commodified scientific publishing and funding. We continue, despite decades of efforts now, to have counterproductive incentive systems in the vast majority of research institutions and national governments that set up research credit systems. Despite publications like data journals and the huge advances we made in open modeling and open code and software and source, etc., we still have data, models, methods, samples, and software remaining second-tier outputs compared to publications. There continues to be a short-term understanding of research benefits and outputs of open science and of attempts to actually just provide services to the community as a whole. And that means that because research keeps being organized in short-term projects, it's actually very hard to get long-term investment in infrastructures and in values for transdisciplinary exchanges of the type that we need to do open work. There is also a constant increase in specialization in science, and also to some extent opacity in what researchers are actually doing vis-a-vis broader publics, and that leads to a loss of intelligibility of the scientific enterprise and in fact public trust in some respects. And of course, we are generally in an environment where there is a humongous commodification of all sorts of results, but also technologies, instruments, digital platforms, and methods that are used to do science. So the vast majority of science continues to be closed science, continues to be rather inscrutable and rather unaccountable. And I would say actually the continuous insistence on gold open access as something which in theory is transformative for openness, but in fact creates all sorts of new exclusions is unfortunately another example of this. And ways in which generative AI is now commodified and commercialized are also big examples. Another source of trouble is what I would call the failure of big data mythologies. We are still in a climate where there's a strong belief in the fact that because we have so much data everywhere, then our science gets almost automatically more accurate, more predictive, we can have better models. But actually there's lots of ways and reasons to worry about that scenario too. I'm not gonna go into big details about this. As you can see, I've written several books about this, and I'm not the only one. Many people have been worrying about this issue. But the fact is, if you create a system where you continue to base your science on secondary data analysis, potentially you're looking at a rather conservative system. A lot of the data that you find online continue to be relatively unreliable, or at the very least, it's very hard to know whether they're reliable or not, because it's very hard to track back which research data infrastructure is actually being maintained and updated and how precisely they relate to other research infrastructure they may be using. There's also a sense in which reliance on ready-made data available online is in fact eroding long-term kind of long-held expertise and methods held in the sciences to try and validate and contextualize the data. The idea is, well, data can speak for themselves, and so we don't have to worry about that. But lots of evidence points to the fact that actually we need to continue to worry about this, because how you interpret the data depends on the extent to which you can actually contextualize them. And reliance on platforms where actually increasingly it's difficult to track data provenance In particular, now I'm thinking about Gen AI models, which allow you to mine through lots of different data sets, but through which is very, very hard to track where data actually come from, has a tendency to make bias invisible. The problem is not so much the fact that we have biased platforms and biased data. That's, again, normal for science. The problem is we cannot account for that bias, particularly systematically. That creates huge problems. Obviously, we're also looking, as I said already, at a highly commodified, commercialized domain where commercial interests tend to be prioritized over scientific interests. And there's a sense in which some of the data landscape that we're looking at the moment encourages research that is either irrelevant or downright damaging to society and the planet, and ignores forms of injustice. I'll come back to this point soon. As I said, this relates also very much to the advent of, at least the spread and emergence on a kind of massive sense of the use of generative AI and foundational models. If you haven't seen this report from the Royal Society, which I participated in putting together, Science in the Age of AI, I think is a useful read in that respect. One of the big lessons from that report, with lots of different case studies brought to the fore, is that what is good for AI is not necessarily good for scientific development. And in fact, there's all sorts of questions around how does one monitor, calibrate, and maintain AI tools, which are actually far from being self-maintaining, which has not really been thought through in a landscape where everybody's turning to AI because the idea is that, well, then we automate things ever more and we can skip human labor. What constitutes a relevant source to train AI models and to continue to develop them continues to be hugely controversial, because there's lots of different ways of answering the question, what evidence, what training data are most relevant to a particular problem. As I already said, very hard to track data provenance in using some of those tools. And of course, we're still looking at an ecosystem which has massive data absences for all sorts of reasons, which skews the ways in which the data landscape, which is fed to AI, actually works. Unsurprisingly, this raises all sorts of questions around the quality and the reliability of the data and research that can be found. We have a rise of deepfakes, of course, which people are very concerned about, and misinformation more generally. Also, the rise of synthetic data is potentially worrying, because as long as synthetic data are used within a particular simulation for obvious, very productive reasons to try and test particular hypotheses, for instance, that's all good and very good and well. But once synthetic data get put in the data ecosystem in a way that actually doesn't necessarily signal their synthetic nature and the reason why they were created in the first place, it can become very confusing for people who actually cannot discriminate anymore between what's synthetic and what's actually experimental data or observational data. It continues to be the case that to determine the quality of a data set or of a model, you tend to need human judgment, very often on a case-to-case basis. Very, very hard to automate that or to apply general principles to this. And yet at the same time, as we all know, we have huge issues with scientific review being still under-resourced, undervalued, labor-intensive. There is a very scarce investment in evaluating not just data, but actually the models used to analyze the data. We work with the National Statistical Authority in producing a code of practice that now implemented, where they're explicitly advising to constantly check, not just when you develop a statistical model, but actually as the model is being instantiated in a variety of other models and AI applications, keep checking and monitoring whether the model keeps doing the work that you want it to do. The idea that you can then resolve many of these issues by just putting stuff on the web and making it transparent doesn't really constitute a solution. Very often it just creates a huge amount of information that nobody can really assimilate. And in fact, it almost creates the illusion that these problems go away as long as you just make things accessible, which again is a problem. I've been making arguments around reproducibility also not really being a solution for some of these issues, partly because reproducibility can mean so many different things depending on which domain you work in, which kinds of experimental techniques or research techniques and methods you're using, and also because even if reproducibility were to work in terms of actually being a proxy for quality checks, it doesn't still help you to fix all the problems we're having with the credit system and the incentive systems that are in science. And I already mentioned the questions around misinformation. Very briefly, and I'll come back to this point again, We also have a long shadow of colonialism, racism, various other forms of discrimination in power and inequity that, of course, haunt the scientific landscape. And this particularly evident, I think, at this point. I mean, I really don't need to tell you, given the heightened political and socioeconomic conflict and variety of views around how we need to think about scientific research, scientific exchange, and its role with relation to policymaking. And this, of course, is heightening inequity even more, is making it ever more difficult to think about the role of diversity in research, and it's important, and is potentially hampering transnational collaboration and scrutiny in all sorts of different ways. Of course, the environmental crisis is exasperating ever more the kind of digital divide that we see between different research locations and the inequity that we see between them. And as I already said, the backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion, which of course is absolutely evident in the States, but is actually starting to affect also many European locations, hampers progress in this respect, at least in my view. Now, open science has been proposed, of course, by many of you also as a potential solution to some of those issues. Of course, there's many different ways in which open science really is conceptualized and operates. In some respects, it may be seen as techno-driven, driven by reliance on digital tools, the internet, the online accessibility of research elements. Another way to think about open science is being driven by considerations relating to intellectual property, the fact that we have forms of ownership and exchange that actually allow for a freer exchange and incentivate the exchange of information and research components. It could also be seen as something which is driven by values, principles such as, for instance, transparency, which define research and its outputs. It could be seen as something which is driven by practices, particularly workflows and ways in which people collaborate and share. And I think the discussion on reproducibility is very much an example of this. Some people conceptualize this as driven by particular rules under which conditions research knowledge production counts as scientific, for instance, the fact that we need to have venues for critical scrutiny, we need to have appropriate research governance, otherwise we cannot guarantee that the results of science are, if you want, anti-dogmatic and cumulative and progressive. And of course, there are ways of conceptualizing open science which are very much related to policy. And these policies typically have some sort of cosmopolitan aspiration, the idea that you can actually have science across and beyond national borders, and you can have exchange across nations and territories that allow you to create better scientific knowledge in the public interest. Now, I think, and I've been arguing, that one view of open science that underpins some efforts, at least in the open science field, is openness as sharing resources. And I've actually critiqued this view as being a view that is very much oriented to the objects, the components of research. The idea is that we focus on what makes up research, and of course data is one component, publication may be another, and so open access, methods and tools and models may be other components. And we focus on making...
C'est curieux que vous disiez ça parce que c'est vraiment ce que M. Joly a voulu aller chercher auprès des jeunes. On parle beaucoup d'éco-anxiété, on parle beaucoup de stress autour des grandes thématiques sur les changements climatiques.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. So the idea is that we focus on making these research components, these objects that put together make up science, if you want, available at any time to everyone. So the focus in this way of thinking about open science is unlimited access to research components. And of course, very often, this way of conceptualizing openness as sharing resources links to the idea of taking advantage of the digital environment. You digitalize resources, it makes it much easier to share them over the internet and to exploit information and communication technologies online to do that kind of sharing. There is a tendency to think that this kind of sharing will always be good because it improves the content of science and also researchers' working conditions potentially by making more visible the work that happens in different phases of scientific research. That it can be global because it reaches everybody which has an interest in research, doesn't matter where they're based, they can still have access to the online resources, at least in principle. And in that sense, it facilitates equity. Now, I think that quite a few of those assumptions have problems relating to them. And I think some of you at least have seen who participated in the seminar have also done work on this. The situation at the moment, particularly post the start of the second Trump administration, is demonstrating the fact that we cannot really assume that there is a cosmopolitan ideal that drives certainly scientific funding in scientific institutions. We're also looking at the moment, the triumph of corporate ownership over research tools and results, particularly when it comes to AI-related tools and resources and platforms. Of course, there's lots of efforts to try and remedy that from publicly funded initiatives, but these are still in the minority compared to what is happening in the commercial realm. The research environment continues to be deeply unequal and fragmented. Digital systems potentially are actually relatively fragile. There are no 100-year plans for how we maintain our digital infrastructures. We usually be lucky if you're thinking in terms of 5 to 10 years. And this creates problems where we rely all of our plans, strategic plans for research development rely on digital landscapes being there forever. The data ecosystem, as I said, has problems, is potentially unsustainable, and it's unclear what role pluralism and epistemic diversity will have in all of this. So the question I'm asking with my research group here in Munich is, in which sense is research open then? Can and should it be, if at all, and why do we continue to talk about openness given all these problems? So what we're doing through this research, which is funded by the European Research Council, is to try and situate research processes and understand what doing open science really means for people under very diverse research conditions. So we're specifically looking at research environments which are very different from one another, both in the resources that are available, in the kind of training that people have, in the kind of background that people have, and also situations where there's blatant inequity between different research locations. And this actually, of course, puts constraints around what can in fact be done. Very briefly, this is the group, the core group that is actually conducting research on this. And this here in the middle, we call it our open science wheel. So these are the specific case studies that we're following very closely. We're collaborating with in different parts of the world to try and study different ways in which people are trying to think through and implement openness and the obstacles and the opportunities they may encounter as they try and do so. As you can see, we have research collaborations in Ghana, in Italy, in Greece. Here is not specified, but we also have a research collaboration with NASA on space biology, and in Brazil and the UK and India and different parts of Germany. I'm not really going to invest a lot of time into the case studies because I really don't want to take all the time just in discussing a few examples, but I'd be more than happy to come back to some of the examples of this research if you ask me in the discussion time. So I'm not going to cover the 2 examples I was hoping to cover because I wanted the general message of this talk to be clear, and I know it's relatively quite controversial, so I'd love to pick your brain on what you think about this. So one of the things that we have been finding by doing all these different case studies and following all these different collaborations with researchers around the world, some of whom are actually not open science activists in any way, they're just people who are trying to do research the best they can. And of course, they've encountered open science guidelines and tools in a variety of different ways as they do research. So some of the findings we have is that we actually found various forms of structural injustice which characterize the research landscape at the global level and at the local level. And these forms of structural injustice actually affect the ways in which open science is implemented in these different domains, and in fact, the ways in which it could be implemented going forward. And this tends to be associated to disparities among the research groups and across research groups in the access they have to resources, and the opportunities they have to use these resources to further their own scientific goals. So let me say something more about this. We found, first of all, that there tends to be an inequity in the resource allocation, in the access that people have to resources, and the ways in which they deploy them. And by resource, I mean, just for those of you who are interested in definitions, anything that can serve as a source of power in social interaction. This is a very well-accepted definition in social science and in philosophy. What we found is, of course, this will not surprise anybody, that resourcing is not necessarily grounded on merit of a particular research group or even on the relevance that particular tools may have to the research that people really want to conduct in their own area. Whether and how science is recognized as worthy of investment, whether and how training is available for research, particularly digital skills, whether scientific investigations intersect with the activities of commercial or military enterprise and how, the national income, social economic disparity between rural and urban areas, the institutional support that people receive in doing the research. All of those factors tend to affect which kind of resources people have access to and how they, in fact, are able to use them. Again, very often in most research environments, except the ones that are very, very highly resourced, like say Ivy League universities in the US, though of course they may be changing also soon, there tends to be a strong tendency to privilege short-term availability of resources for very short-term needs, rather than building capacity for the longer term, which has all sorts of implications for open science, of course. And very often, the training and the adoption of technology is done post factum. So many people are given the opportunity maybe to accept to use certain resources, which may have been developed, for instance, even by public platforms for open science, like OpenAIRE, but they have very little involvement because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the time, they don't have the opportunity in the design of those tools and in their governance. We also found generally there tends to be very often a misalignment between the resources that people have access to and the scientific goals that they're trying to pursue. So the local constraints people are subjected to, their practical exigencies, which materials they have access to, which reagents they have access to, which kinds of technology they have access to, and also the socio-political agenda of the environments they're working in, tend to very strongly shape research directions. And this may be in tension with the scientific interests of the groups that are actually doing the research. And we also saw that the digital divide, which we of course find very often, there are many regions in the world where there's no reliable access to even broadband internet connection, many regions in the world where there's no reliable access to data storage facilities or to the kind of computing power that will allow you to use a lot of applications developed in higher research places and so on and so forth. These kind of digital divides tend to also be and to become a divide in what we may call the power, the epistemic power, the power to do science that different groups may have, because it ends up marking a division between people who actually have the power to shape the research agenda, both locally and internationally, and people who cannot do this for a variety of different reasons. And of course, what we also found very often is a misalignment between the scientific goals of a given group and the labor conditions that they're actually subjected to. And digital divide, again, tends to be sharpened by the constraints and expectations on what counts as credit for whom and within which system. So very often we have situations where, for instance, centralized national research systems, such as, for instance, in Italy, don't really tend to acknowledge any service-related work or any open science-related work, particularly not any interdisciplinary form of research. They only acknowledge high-level, well, what are taken to be within the system, high-level publications done within a particular discipline that researchers are responsible for. And there's many other examples of this being something that really shapes the ways in which people do work and labor under and are employed and continue their scientific careers, no matter what their actual aspirations would be. And of course, then research goals become shaped by the expectations that researchers have around their future prospects of employment, including what they see as the expected outcomes and the valued outcomes of their research. Now, what are the implications of these kinds of findings, which again, I don't think will surprise anybody, but we're trying to synthesize the results of what is now a 4-year-long almost research endeavor? Well, first of all, is that this kind of injustice affects the research content that is being developed. The research directions that people follow are picked to comply with existing constraints, and this results in a lack of research effort spent on topics, domains, and goals that in fact tend to be most relevant to the most vulnerable scientists and their context, because these are the people that have the least power to actually shape their own research agenda. This also in turn means that a certain exclusion of researchers, which comes from these mechanisms of divide and, if you want, partly self-generated discrimination, from being able to contribute to the internationally recognized body of knowledge to the best of their ability, and also as part of that, to the kind of methods and tools that are developed to be able, for instance, to make science open. And this results potentially in a diminished research quality of science as a whole globally, because there's not as much confrontation between different perspectives and different viewpoints and different potential contributors to science as there could be without taking this kind of structural injustice into account. And in fact, we found all too often that open science initiatives, no matter how well-intentioned and well-structured, ended up being relatively ineffective because it was very, very difficult to implement them on the ground. And in fact, were sometimes even just invisible or impossible for people to take up because their expectations around what those tools would be useful for and also what kind of skills would be needed to use them didn't match the expectations that were put at the basis of actually realizing the tools. One thing I want to really stress here is that diversity in methods, diversity in materials, diversity in standards, diversity in goals, diversity in social conditions really is the name of the game within scientific practice globally. And so it should be, because after all, science has become so hyper-specialized because different researchers working with different materials, different problems, and in different territories need to find, and have very often found, very, very appropriate ways of producing results which are fine-tuned to the characteristics of the systems they're working with and the systems they're working within. Now, this, of course, clashes all the time, as you well know, with a standardizing drive that needs to underpin sharing efforts in open science. Of course, it is crucial to try and determine some standards and some common platforms to try and make research elements interoperable, to try and encourage reproducibility and reuse. But one is to keep asserting the fact that there is very, very good scientific reasons to have and continue to foster domain-specific, system-specific methods, standards, and evaluative criteria. This is not just people holding on to bygone cultures and conservative research cultures. This is about trying to find, for every specific case of research, the right balance between having systems and methods that are able to pick up on the characteristics and the problems manifested in a particular context, but at the same time, broad enough and standardized enough to be able to be understood by people looking at maybe similar problems elsewhere, or anyhow to be able to exchange materials and insights from people doing this elsewhere. So how do we build open science with diversity as a starting point? Really is the key question that we keep asking through the many initiatives and collaborations that we are interested in. And one of the ways in which we think about this is really by putting humans at the absolute center of what it means to be doing open science. Think about scientific practice as a social practice, something which requires first and foremost communication and engagement. And in fact, collective forms of agency and organized agency to function. Collective agency is what makes research scrutinizable, is what makes research into a common good, and is in fact what anchors the relationship between science and broader sections of society, including sections of society which have a lot of knowledge and expertise to contribute to research itself. So the way in which we are conceptualizing openness is in fact within a more process-oriented approach. When we're thinking about discovery and research, not so much as putting together at certain stages different research elements, but actually as having interactions with the world which are skilled, which are distributed, and which are constantly underpinned by agency. And of course, you can capture different bits of those interactions in procedures through particular research elements, just kind of, in a sense, reifying some of those moments. This is necessary. But it has to be really clear that this is just, a way we have to capture moments of research, be able to share them some way, somehow, and make them available to others. But this really is a process rather than anything else. So the focus we have in our research is on the social agency that underpins research, the kind of intimacies, the trust, the collaborative relationship that are needed very often to be able to, in fact, not only share, but reuse and build on each other's insights in ways that are scientifically reliable and also responsible. And in that sense, actually really putting questions of justice and diversity as crucial conditions for inquiry, without creating conditions of trust, where there can be effective cooperation and exchange of views and collaboration between very different groups around the world, whether they're working in the same domain or across domains, then we're going to have a really big problem in trying to really realize openness in research. So we are thinking about openness as a question of establishing connections and doing it in a way that's judicious. We're not talking about everybody taking to everybody else all at the same time at any moment. This would be, of course, completely insane. We're not talking about being inclusive at all costs, no matter what people are being included in. That's also completely ridiculous. The question is to think about which kinds of social interactions, which forms of expertise, which types of skills are needed given the context and the research questions being asked in a particular type of research and given the kind of social context within the research is conducted. So the idea here is to really stress that identify what constitutes the relevant context for a particular research, the context in which you assess it, the context in which you expect results to be maybe potentially reused and made sense of, is in fact itself part of an investigation. It's not something that you worry about later. It's something that should really be included in thinking about research in the first place. So rather than thinking about open science as an exercise in trying to be as transparent as possible, trusting the fact that being transparent will somehow enhance quality by making it possible for people who knows with which time, with which resources, but somebody to actually have a look at your data or methods and provide some feedback and make it better, and therefore become more inclusive. I just don't think, empirically, historically, this trajectory has worked particularly well, except for people who in fact have the time and the money to engage in this particular way. We're trying to advocate for an inversion of this trajectory, where first we think about what forms of inclusions are relevant for particular forms of research. And by doing that, we set up tools and forms of communication and scrutiny that will indeed enhance the research itself and lead us to understand which forms of transparency, which forms of openness may be most conducive to doing good research, reliable research, good for society, for the public interest in those instances. So the view of open science we are trying to advocate for on the basis of our empirical work is to really focus not so much on giving unlimited access, but fostering responsible use, trying to think critically and constructively, of course, around how digital platforms may support existing and future works, and also around under which conditions they do not. And in fact, encourage the development of human relationships and forms of social agency that in fact can sustain and nurture the use of digital platforms and therefore scientific research in the longer term. Also, just accept the fact that most developments, most tools in open science are discriminatory. They will be good for some and not others. They will research and infrastructure. So the question becomes, can we make those explicit, and we can have maybe explicit conversations with a variety of stakeholders around who is being favored by some choices, who isn't, and whether there is some form of agreement or at least an understanding of this. Similarly, for pretty much any platform, any resource, this will make things accessible to some and not to others. Who is being privileged in this would be very important to discuss in a transparent sense. And in that sense, transparent discussions around the governance of these tools would potentially give rise to more trustworthiness and then, therefore, facilitate more equity. I think many of the sentiments are echoed by the OECD when they're talking about inclusive open science, and we've been advocating, certainly in my group for a long time, kind of more than a decade now, so it also has found its way in the UN recommendations for open science, for instance, but as you will all recognize, we're still far from being able to actually implement diversity as a starting point for many open science initiatives. Some pointers to how this may be done, and in fact is being done at least in some instances, is to acknowledge multiple perspectives and the fact that there are well-established but diverse cultures of openness. So in that sense, be very, very careful whenever we have highly centralized assessment criteria to determine what is or isn't open. This may indeed need to vary depending on the discipline, the domain, and the context. And I think it's also very important to try and support openness, not just within publicly funded institutions with the idea that this is taxpayers' money, but in fact across public and privately funded institutions for all sorts of reasons, partly also because by now it's very, very hard to find the boundaries between private and public, given the full and rightful also interconnections that there are between these worlds. And of course, try to invest in, understand ever more, why is it that scientists have such resistance to at least some open science initiatives? What are the different motivations for specific habits and preferences? And actually what may be the real issues that underpin some of the resistance that we find on the ground. Obviously, for a long time, many of us and you have advocated for trying to support researchers' transitions to open science, don't just delegate it down and leave it as a big problem for PhD students. Also not to buy into novelty narrative relating to open science as needing to be relating to very high level or cutting edge technologies, or being something which is a kind of new innovation. In many instances in research, it's been around for a long time. And of course, also to try and be aware of attempts to interpret openness as a way to actually overcome subjective judgments and know-how in science. In fact, I would say subjective judgments is very often part of what it means to be an expert, is cultivating over many years familiarity with particular tools, with materials, with situations, and with certain discussions that allow you to actually exercise a certain amount of expert knowledge and judgment in setting up your research. This is something that very often, it almost looks like some open science initiatives wants to discourage, because it's very, very hard to formalize some of those types of expertise in ways that can be, if you want, commodified as an object that can be shared. But I think we just need to take on board the fact that know-how and tacit knowledge is a very important part of science, and particularly very important to the social aspects of science. And there's only so much we can do in transforming that into an object that can be shared through digital platforms. This is something that requires a different form of intervention. Just to give you a very, very quick example of an argument we made that is pretty concrete when it comes to this. We think that one of the implications of adopting this view of open science is to really privilege questions of findability of data over the accessibility of data. So very often, we're thinking about the FAIR principles as something that we should emphasize equally. So we should make data accessible, and we should also worry about the findability of data. But I think in far too many instances, there are problems with sharing data. Open data is not just an issue in terms of, what happens to sensitive data when it comes to personal data or medical data. It can also become an issue where we still have, for the vast majority of data, even produced in the public realm, very little idea of how to reward communities on which data are actually being collected. For instance, the case of agriculture, land management, but also in the case of urban mobility and urban behaviors. Is very, very hard to prevent having discussions that having practices that actually are exploitative and extractive in relation to data that are put online, even with the best intentions and even in the best possible, more inclusive way. So I think actually, rather than always insisting on making data accessible, insisting on making them findable, and then letting people negotiate with each other once they find each other and they say, oh, there is this group, there is this initiative, there's this platform that actually has data that interests me. Conditions under which the data can in fact be accessed potentially, if they need to be accessed at all. I mean, sometimes through data visitations or data narratives and data stories, we may have other ways of working on those data and sharing analysis of the data that doesn't actually involve sharing data directly. So we're basically trying to encourage communities of practice, and we've done this with a variety of collaborators over the years, where what we're fostering is contact between data creators, data curators, data holders, data users, to try and increase trust, to try and create opportunities for better contextualizing data when trying to interpret it, to create opportunities for further collaboration, and in fact, to give more visibility and credit to data creators, and in fact, to the people who are curating the data, which are so often, as you well know, because many of you are involved in that kind of work, absolutely crucial to discovery. I will conclude just by saying that some of this work we are pushing in a very concrete way. As in my introduction, we are now launching, we're about to launch what we're calling the Public Science Lab, where we are bringing together a variety of different collaborations that we've had over the years on these issues, and providing a platform to continue those collaborations, and also getting to talk to each other, so that people that are working on different parts of sustainable open science and open data can actually learn from each other's initiatives. This also we're doing through the Ethical Data Initiative, which actually is going to have its town hall, which is also available online on the 31st of March, so in less than a couple of weeks. You're all very, very warmly invited to have a look at our website, just ethicaldatainitiative.org, see what we're doing, get involved, give us feedback on our activities, and participate in the town halls and become affiliated with the initiative. We're really trying to contribute to the coordination of responsible data initiatives around the world, and also provide lots of education tools, training tools, in complement, of course, with already wonderful initiatives that are happening in that space, so that we can continue to build on that. And we are launching all sorts of initiatives to try and do transdisciplinary research on the ground. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this now, but I'm more than happy to give more details around that. And in closing, I just want to thank my group, which includes some of the people in this picture, in fact, many, many more people who are collaborating with us all over the world. And I'm incredibly grateful for their time and their wisdom and their insight all the time. If you're curious about some of this work, if you go to opensciencestudies.eu, you will find not just, of course, lots of publications, all of them open access in one way or the other, but also resources. We have produced a research game that is free to download from our site. We have an art film we produced trying to illustrate some of those concepts that we're very happy to send the link for screening in different locations, and so on and so forth. So with this, I'll finally stop talking and be very happy to get into a discussion.
Thank you, Sabina, for your presentation. We will now take questions from the audience, and we will end at 5 p.m. or we can have a few more minutes if it's needed. So if you want to ask a question, just write it in the chat, and Sabina, if you don't mind, will read the questions. Thank you.
So sorry, so should you want me to read the questions and answer?
Yes, if you don't mind. I think the first question was...
Scrolling back into the chat to see.
Yes, can you see?
Just 1 second. Yeah, so I already answered. Thanks, Charlotte, for asking about references. But I think if you go to the website, you will find everything that we've been doing, and also some presentations and materials of the kind. We also have a LinkedIn group that people are really very, very welcome to join, called Philosophy of Open Science on LinkedIn. If you cannot find it, please get in touch with me, and more than happy to welcome you to the group and to invite you to the group. And yeah, we try to use the website, LinkedIn. I use Blue Sky now, social media, of course, Twitter. Well, X has been out of the question since quite a long time, and Mastodon sometimes also to try and disseminate our results and have discussions. Yeah, so question from Denis. Your results are very general and probably apply to many countries. Are there any countries where the trend is more positive? Now, gosh, it's very, very hard, of course, to give country-related trends. That's partly why, I mean, I haven't gotten into the specific cases we are following, but that's partly why we tend to work on very, very detailed cases in a qualitative sense, really following what scientists are doing on the ground in particular locations. It's certainly the case that the effectiveness of open science initiatives really, if I want to give a general trend, it correlates with money. There is no question around this. The countries which have institutions that are better resourced, where researchers have more time, or relatively speaking, of course, we all are overwhelmed, I know, but relatively speaking, more time to devote to service-related work and to curating their data, for instance, or to get open science training, or to get training in digital skills. All of those realities are realities where it's much more likely that the kind of tools being developed by some of the big open science initiatives at the moment will be useful. Of course, when it comes to open publishing, this is even more dramatic because there you can really see at this point a huge wedge between people who work in institutions that can afford to be part of transformative agreements and therefore have access to gold open access journals, which are now become, as far as I can see, sadly, really the standard. And people who are not part of the transformative agreements and were paying for a kind of open fee to be able to publish your research in an open sense, in a gold open access open access journal would be basically the equivalent of 3 months of your salary. So all of this is very prohibitive. I know that there are movements to try and provide waivers to people who are publishing, but we basically have created a publishing system, I believe, which systematically discriminates against people who don't work in institutions, who have the power and the resources to have specific agreements made with publishers that are favorable to them. And of course, there is hope on the horizon with the Diamond Open Access Initiative gaining strength, and the wonderful work that's been done on that front, but the situation is still pretty dramatic. So I can't quite tell you a specific story about particular countries, but basically look for where the money is. I would say that if there is a generalization that comes from our case studies, is really this. Amy is saying your philosophy and many of the ideas echo the work of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. Absolutely. And of course, we've had exchanges and of course, we have had exchanges over the years many, many times. We haven't collaborated formally. One of my closest collaborators was also part of our group, Rachel Ankeny, actually has had, and I think still now has a formal collaboration with the group. So yeah, there's been lots of exchanges there. And, when doing much more specific presentations on particular tools that are particularly useful, things like the local knowledge labels have been really immensely useful and resourceful in those kinds of conversations. So thanks for signaling that to everybody. Of course, one of the things I should say actually in relation to the Global Indigenous Data Alliance is that a lot of the work that I'm interested in and involved in, partly also because I think there is wonderful work already happening on indigenous knowledge and indigenous data, concerns local data, which may not be necessarily going for all sorts of very valid reasons under the category of indigenous, but are nevertheless produced under very particular conditions in ways which are very situated, very often by people who are in vulnerable situations for one way or the other, and don't yet, however, come under the category of indigenous knowledge or indigenous data. So I think many of the lessons taken from the Indigenous Data Alliance really should be extended to a lot more data than just data that are classified as coming under indigenous knowledge. And vice versa, I think it'd be very useful to think about what the lessons that are coming from basically deprived or under-resourced research environments could be going back to thinking about indigenous data issues. But, as I said, this kind of cross-pollination is absolutely ripe for the taking. It'd be great to have a more formal collaboration again at some point, but I think these conversations keep happening. And hopefully will happen more and more also through the Ethical Data Initiative. Then Anna is asking, even from my fairly privileged and well-resourced position as a tenure research in the Reasonable Resource Institute, I often have the feeling that too much of the open science activities run their own party, where I don't really feel fully welcome. Too much of the discussion and activities speak a language, specifically the language of the US community, often not very accessible to those who merely want to make their science open. Now, I couldn't agree with you more, in the sense that this is absolutely the experience that we witnessed now, like basically in almost every research environment we've entered, which wasn't an environment that had been already actively lobbying for open science and had the resources to really engage in open science for many years. All of those people were, at least in principle, favorable to openness in one way or the other, but they felt alienated by the open science movement. Now, I really want to say, and I want to say this very clearly, that I'm not critiquing necessarily the open science movement. I mean, I've been part of this for years. I know very well the incredible amount of effort that has gone into precisely realizing the goals that I'm talking about here. And the fact that it is just extremely difficult because science is situated, whether you want it or not. So the big challenge that people in highly resourced environments or more highly resourced environments face is the fact that on the one hand, they actually have the responsibility and the opportunity to provide and produce tools that actually can and should be usable around the world by many other colleagues based in different spaces and in different domains. And at the same time, they're aware of the fact that, well, ultimately their perception, their vision of what science is and what is necessary to it, and how we think, say, about data use or about coding and programming and the role of open source, all of this is absolutely shaped, as it should be, as it always is, by your own experience, your own background, your own skills, the reality you experience on an everyday basis. Now, it's impossible to breach that tension between the fact that you're necessarily situated somewhere, but you're trying to provide a service that will serve many more people who have very different experiences and visions from you, without a huge investment in dialogue, in governance, in transdisciplinary exchanges. And as we all know, that money is extremely hard to come by, and particularly now is politically unpalatable, to say the least. And there are serious constraints in doing this. So I think one needs to be, of course, recognize the fact that many open science initiatives have tried to go in that direction, but they had limited opportunities to do this because they had very limited resources in terms of actually fostering that kind of engagement. They had limited time scales to realize some of the projects that they were doing. Typically, we also know, when we're looking at the inside of open science infrastructures, that they're typically, for what they want to do and achieve, they're always under-resourced. So there are tensions there, which one needs to recognize, which have then generated the situation we are in now. So when I say that open science is to be conceptualized differently, I'm not just talking to people who are doing open science on an everyday basis. I actually very frequently and mostly talking to people who are investing in these resources, investing in thinking about how the research system is organized and funded, because this is really where a lot of this game is played, for better or worse. Thank you so much for the link to the Broken Science paper, which I will open right now. I wasn't aware of, so I will absolutely have a look at this. I'm very grateful. And then thank you very much also to René for putting the website of the Ethical Data Initiative again online. And Katrina is asking, is there a greater imperative for open science in some disciplines more than others? And which are these, if so? That's a great question, and a question that we've been asking, the two of us, to each other for quite some time. I think that particularly for people who have the opportunity to do so, it's time to stop looking for low-hanging fruits. I really mean it. When it comes to biology, please, let's stop putting all of our emphasis on omics data sharing. Can we please think about complex, heavy, hard-to-read data files, sound, observational reports, phenomics data, all sorts of different types of imaging. I mean, in the end, of course, there's been huge advances in phenomics, say, in biology, but we're still very much struggling with questions around how to digitize even some of those systems, how to relate some of those digital elements to material elements of research, and how do we consistently, coherently use metadata and ontologies around this. I mean, what worries me enormously at this point is that I'm seeing not progress, but in fact, regress in some of the fields here. So particularly with the advent of massive uses of Gen AI, a lot of people are putting together huge data repositories and infrastructures, not even worrying anymore about the semantic structure of these things. As if just because we can now work on more data faster resolves the problem. If anything, in my view, it makes it much, much, much worse. So what I really worry about is that the domains that most need this, partly because these are the most useful data we have, data about public health, complex data about kind of orphan diseases, complex data about symptomatology of different types, data that actually allows you to relate climate data to environmental, to geological, to, different kinds of data conglomerates and mashups. I mean, these are situations where we really, the future of our planet depends on being able to handle this kind of information properly. And this is where the least resources are in open science at the moment, because these are by far the most difficult to handle. We need to seriously lobby, all of us, for this trend to turn some way, somehow, within our very limited power, because I really do see this as a big, big threat at the moment. Not made better, but the constant search for general purpose technologies and general purpose AI, which is becoming a disastrous, push towards over standardization and total disregard for the kind of system related knowledge that I've been talking about. Thanks so much for the very nice comments. And so Rodrigo is asking, as a finishing PhD student in quantitative life sciences in Canada, congratulations on that. I'm interested in open science and looking for an internship. Do you have any pointers or resources you suggest for somebody interested in leaping into the open science field, who's open to contribute formally to the discussion and research on open science? Gosh, yeah, I think many people in the room at the moment are better equipped than me to give you pointers. So I hope that now I haven't looked yet at what's under this. But yeah, thanks, Amy, for putting Sortie into this. And I think, you know, a lot of this will depend, in fact, on the domain you're working in, right? So I think rather than looking on more generalized, maybe open science initiatives, I would suggest you're clearly a biologist, look to what is happening in your domain. One place which I think is just fantastic for getting an introduction to some of the work that's happening on the ground and participating right away in working groups that will help you to get deeper and also maybe find jobs, internships in the domains that interest you, is participating in Research Data Alliance meetings. These are ostensibly only about data, but they're not really, because data becomes a gateway to think about publishing issues, to think about coding issues, sharing methods, reproducibility issues, and so on and so forth. The next RDA assembly is fully online. It's happening in April from the 7th onwards. So I would recommend that you check this out. It's brilliant. Also, the president of the RDA collaborates very strongly with the Ethical Data Initiative. We actually have a working group on data ethics that's starting very shortly within the Research Data Alliance, and she will be giving a keynote on these kinds of issues at the Ethical Data Initiative Town Hall, which I mentioned before, in 10 days' time here in Munich. This will be broadcast online, so I would strongly encourage you also maybe to have a look at that, because I'm sure she's going to have very, very useful pointers. But basically, within the RDA, there are working groups on most things. And what's great about that community is that if you don't find that what really interests you is there, you can start your own working group and you will find a lot of people that want to join you. So that's at least a start. And of course, you know, finding jobs was complicated, but at least there are good groups around that are very accessible and are pushing for some of those issues.